would be 2242, something over 2,000 years. And from the creation up to Abraham, according to the numbers in the Septuagint, there would be something over 3,000 years, 3,412 or thereabouts. There's also the Samaritan Pentateuch, so-called, which has somewhat different numbers. So there's a little question of text here, but for the general purposes we are discussing, these differences are not all that significant. So that is that view, and my evaluation and criticism of it will hold off on until we have described the other views. The second of these views, I said we might call the dynastic view. It is not nearly as literal in its approach to the language, and it regards these names not as just individual patriarchs who lived so long, but as the names of dynasties that they represented. And so it's not just one individual that is thus labeled, but it is a whole succession of, who knows how many successors. So it's a succession of dynasties. Each one lasted so long and then was succeeded by the next one. And now if you were wanting then to make your computation of the total period, it would be, of course, when the one dynasty came to an end, that the next one began. And so if you want to get the total span, you wouldn't add up the little number x, you would add up the big number, the total lifespan of the individual, which is being interpreted as the total duration of the dynasty. And so you would add up all these big numbers, and now then what totals do you get? This time you get something like this, that from Adam up to the flood, instead of being about 1,600 years, is something over 8,000 years. It would be 8,225 years, perhaps. Or if we take it from Adam again up to Terah's life there, up to Abraham, it would be something over 11,000 years, about 11,571, I guess. So there is that view, and let's look at and evaluate and actually dismiss it rather quickly, because the basic question is whether there is biblical warrant for taking this kind of language in that loose way. Now, it may often be that we must recognize that a certain language is not intended literally, but is intended in some other way, and as we do so, however, we want some evidence for reaching that conclusion, and here I don't find the biblical warrant for treating that language in that way, and actually there seem to be some problems with this matter, and among them you find that you're actually dealing with one family throughout here. This dynasty actually is involved genealogically with the next one, and so I always have thought that if one were trying to describe a succession of dynasties, that to select the genealogical form for it would be singularly ill-advised, because how do dynasties very often or even normally arise? It isn't by another descendant in the same genealogical line coming on the scene, but it's usually in terms of someone usurps the throne from a different family, or some foreign conqueror comes in and takes over and sets up a new dynasty. And so a genealogical format would be a strange way of describing a history of what would actually be one continuous family here. And then you encounter details in the text that you don't know how to deal with. For example, if it speaks about Noah was 600 years old when he entered the ark, and what is this in terms of a a dynasty, and in fact you have a couple of different dynasties, Noah and his son Shem, for example, who are entering the ark together. Very strange things happening. When you come to the end of these genealogies, you come to the figure of Abraham, you know you're not dealing with a dynasty, you're dealing with the man Abraham, and so forth. So I don't find that there's really too much to be said that would make us take seriously this dynastic view. And we proceed then quickly to the third view, which we're calling the selective. Now we call the first view the complete view, and so of course the opposite of it might be called the incomplete view, and that doesn't sound too good, so I prefer selective as a title for this. And all it's saying then, now as over against the dynastic view, this third view is very much a literal type of view, because it does take these names as the names of individuals, and it does take the long lifespans attributed to them as literally being the case that they actually did live so long. The one difference then is simply that it challenges the notion that in every case we have an immediate father-son relationship. What it does say is that there are gaps in the line of unknown duration between them. And so what we are doing is we're saying that in some cases, not necessarily in every case, in some cases there may be additional details in the text that indicate that there was in fact an immediate father-son relationship in certain cases. All we're saying is that that isn't necessarily the case every time. Sometimes then when it says that A lived X numbers of years and begat B, is that it means that at that point in his life there branched off from him the line which, we don't know how much later, eventuated in B. The ancestor of B was born, begotten at that point in the life of A. And so we have this unknown space between this and this point, whether this individual was born even within the total lifespan of A or after that, there would be no way of knowing. And so that's where a certain elasticity or principle of discontinuity, enters in to the picture. And ultimately it becomes a question of one's sense of how much discontinuity you feel you can allow, how much elasticity you think is allowable in the text as to how ancient a date you might be ready to accept for the origin of man, consistent with biblical teaching. But just for the moment, that's what the view holds to. And so the date of the origin of man, we couldn't set precise dates for. Adam to the flood to Abraham. Can't set absolute dates in terms of the biblical teaching. That would be this third view. Now, let's evaluate things, first of all, then, by dealing with this third view and trying to show, then, that there is exegetical basis, then, for this as a valid option, and more than that, as a matter of fact, for this being the more probable view, and more than that, when one comes to consider the weaknesses in the first view, I think that this view is not only a possible view and a probable view, but it's a view that's actually demanded. And so that's what we will be trying then to do. Now then, what are the biblical indicators that this is a valid option, that we don't have to accept a literalist view of the subject? And the first point to show that is, and please note, I'm not arguing from the fact that I believe that, as a matter of fact, man has existed maybe 100,000 years. I do think he has, all right, in terms of the evidence of the fossil remains, and whether or not you accept that Neanderthal is identifiable with modern man or not. That is a serious thing you want to think about and consult and see the evidence for. But whether or not you think Neanderthal man is identifiable with modern man, which is a Adamic man, or not, still just in terms of modern man, Homo sapiens sapiens. I think the evidence does indicate he's been around, something on the order of 100,000 years or so, possibly more. But that's not my starting point. It is not that I have come to that evident conclusion on the basis of my limited assessment of the scientific evidence, and now I'm going to turn to the Bible and make the Bible conform with that, whether it wants to or not. That would be wrong. Okay, if that's what I'm doing, please don't follow that kind of a hermeneutic. But I don't think that is what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to follow a hermeneutic. What does the Bible, biblical evidence, show? And if it turns out then that provides us with a position which gives us some flexibility in dealing with the scientific evidence, and instead of putting us in the position where we have to reject it all and say none of this evidence is valid, well, that's a bonus that happens to be there, and that's the method I'm trying to follow here. So what is the biblical evidence now that does indicate that this is a possible view? First, as to terminology, the terms that are used, Father, Son, beget, and also the matter of the genre we're dealing with, the literary form of genealogy. If we study the terms that we find here and this genealogical genre elsewhere, we will find that these terms are used in a non-literal way, and we do find that this genealogical genre often will be incomplete, and it is not always by any means complete. As for the terminology, the language of son and beget, that hardly should take a lot of discussion. All of us, with our general reading of the Bible, certainly are familiar with places where the language of someone being a son refers to someone rather than an immediate son, and where the language of begat refers to something more remote than an immediate one-to-one relationship. And as I said earlier, Matthew, when we were talking about the Eila Toledot formula, which is what we are dealing with here in Genesis 5 and 11. Each of these genealogies is introduced by that formula. And when we were dealing with that, I said, now, this formula is found elsewhere, including Matthew 1. And so here, if we look at Matthew 1, which has the same heading that these chapters have, we can get some good, and where we have a genealogy again, you have some good analogy of Scripture. That's our principle. That's our fundamental hermeneutical principle, is the analogy of Scripture, that you interpret Scripture by Scripture. That's what we're trying to do here. And so we look at Matthew 1, which is the same genealogical form, has the same type of heading. This is the book of the generations of Jesus Christ, same as as Genesis 5. This is the book of the generations of Adam. And when you look at Matthew 1, right away in the opening verse, it speaks about Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. So there's the term son, used for a relationship involving a 1,000-year gap between Christ and David, and again between David and Abraham. Then the term begat, and of course there are numerous other illustrations. Then the term begat, still within this genealogy in Matthew 1, in the 8th verse, it speaks about Joram begetting Uzziah. Joram begat Uzziah. Who was Uzziah? Uzziah was a great-great-grandson of Joram. So the term begat is used for something other than immediate sonship. How do we know that Uzziah was not the immediate son, but a great-great-grandson? Well, we know from the fact that there are other genealogies in the Old Testament that are more complete than the one in Matthew 1. For example, in 2 Kings 8:29, 2 Kings 11:2, 2 Kings 14:1 and 21. Now, you can just check out the evidence in any Bible dictionary on these individuals, and you'll see that this is the case. And so here, someone is said to beget someone who is actually the great grandson. So there is this gap there. So he begat the great-great-grandson. Who knows, just from that one text, apart from other evidence, how long the gap might have been. And while we're talking about begat, we might also then bring in the term, the woman bore a child. And we might think, well, a man begat a son that could be a remote one, but a woman bore a child that wasn't actually her own child. Even that kind of looser usage is found. And in this case, if you check and study Genesis 46, verse 18, you will find there in the list of the individuals who went down into Egypt with Jacob, the statement that a woman bore someone who other biblical evidence indicates was actually her great-grandson. And so this is just to give us a little feeling for the non-literal usage, which is perfectly biblical usage in terms of all of these terms. In Genesis 10, it even speaks about peoples, larger groups of people, as being begotten by other groups or as being the sons of other people. It speaks about the city of Sidon, and it says that that's Canaan's firstborn. And here's a political situation where the language of sonship is used. So that's our first point. The first point is that the way we are taking this terminology is not forced or unwarranted. It is perfectly consistent with attested biblical usage elsewhere. Now then, as for the genre, here we're dealing with a genealogy, and we're saying that it is a selective one rather than a complete one. It is an incomplete genealogy. Is that valid? Is it not always the intention of a genealogy to be complete? Well, what's the biblical evidence once again? And again, of course, we can start with Matthew. And here is a genealogy, and well, a very abbreviated genealogy in the first verse, Christ the son of David, son of Abraham, a very incomplete genealogy. But then even when the details are given in the following verses, as we saw in the 8th verse, it's not a complete genealogy, certainly between Joram and Uzziah, and perhaps at other places you might find evidence of the same. So it simply is not the case that biblical genealogies are always complete. No, they are often incomplete. Another illustration or two of this sort of thing in Ezra chapter 7. Here Ezra is tracing his own genealogy back to Aaron, high priest. Each link in the chain is described in terms of son. This one is the son of the preceding one, and it is a genealogy. And yet, as we learned by comparing with Ezra 7, the material in 1 Chronicles 6, we find that Ezra 7 lacks various names. And so the Ezra 7 genealogy is an incomplete one. Ezra was interested in letting us know he can trace his lineage to Aaron. Perhaps there were some other people in his lineage he didn't care as to know about whatever reasons he hadn't given them all. That's an incomplete genealogy. And once again, there could be many others. I'll give one more. In the book of Ruth, it ends there in chapter 4 with a genealogy that traces the names from the figure of Pharez, Pharez, back in the patriarchal period down to David. And the number of names, the period covered there involves about 800 years. And the number of names that doesn't begin to cover the time involved. And once again, we have some other genealogies in 1 Chronicles 23 and 24 that show that genealogy at the end of the book of Ruth is not a complete one. So in terms of terminology and in terms of the genre, what we are doing is perfectly consistent with biblical usage elsewhere. So it is a possible interpretation. Now, the next point I want to make is that the indications are such that it is the probable view, that it is the preferable view. And this has to do with the fact, all right, here you have a genealogy. It might be complete, it might be incomplete, we found. Any way, any kind of indications that might be present, that the intention is not complete. Any possible indications of that? Any literary signals? Now that's the point I want to make. Yes, there are literary signals in Genesis 5 and 11 that the intention is not to give a complete genealogy, but rather that the author here is influenced in his literary style, as the author of the book of Genesis we've seen was, by a favoritism for certain conventional numbers, so that numerical schemes or formats are desirable literary achievement. Formats involving the number 10 or involving the number 3, structuring things that way, so that the numbers involved convey some meaning in themselves. And again, then we return to Matthew 1, our main analogy here for Genesis 5 and 11, in order to see here the indication. Now, we've already seen that Matthew 1 is an incomplete genealogy. And now what is very interesting here is the 17th verse then in Matthew 1, where after giving us this genealogy, Matthew looks back at it, and in case we have missed the fact, he tells us how he has set it up. And he says, so, all the generations from Abraham to David, he began by saying Christ, the son of David, David, the son of Abraham. Now he says, so, all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations. And then from David to the exile are 14 generations. And then from the exile to Christ are 14 generations. So he underscores this 14 plus 14 plus 14. And the 14th is, of course, the double Sabbath. So that in effect 3 14s are 6 7s. And what he is doing is saying, look at history from the Abrahamic covenant with its promise of the Messianic king who will come from him, up to the Messianic king himself, who comes onto the scene, Jesus the Christ. And he divides that period into 6 Sabbath periods, and then Christ comes, and Christ introduces, therefore, the 7th and the final, the Jubilee Sabbath. In other words, he has arranged his genealogy in such a way that it will convey the historical theological point that Christ brings in the last age, the eschatological age, the final Sabbath of God, the age of fulfillment. That is what he seemed to be suggesting. And what is interesting is that in order to reach that conclusion that there are 14 generations from Abraham to David, and 14 generations from David to the exile, and then 14 generations from the exile to Christ, he actually has to use the name of David twice. So that David is the name that ends the first period of 14. And so from the promise of the king to the arrival of the king is the theme of the first 14 generations. And then David's name must also be counted as the first name in the history of the Davidic dynasty, which is the period then from David up to the exile, where he breaks off, makes the next division in his history. 14 generations, 2 sabbatical periods, as it were, devoted to the history of the Davidic dynasty from its inauguration to the exile, which marks its termination. And then the last 14 is the history then of that promise of the king in the post-monarchic period, because of course after the exile the Davidic kingship was not established again, and so the last 14 cover the gap leading up to the appearance of the Son of David, who is the Christ, the ultimate fulfillment of the Abrahamic promise. But the 14 plus 14 plus 14 then is clearly working in with that other, along with 10 and 3, 7, right in the first chapter of the Bible, 7, the sabbatical thing. That number is going to appear in the symbolism of history all along. And Matthew utilizes it for that. So what I'm saying is this: here is a literary signal, this use of the conventional significant number 7 in order to structure the history, in order to tell us the significance of the advent of Christ as the fulfillment of Davidic covenant and of Abrahamic covenant. Here is the promised Messianic king. It's worth also pointing out that a similar interest informs the genealogy that we have in the book of Luke. Now, Luke also then early on has his genealogy of Jesus, which differs from the one in Matthew, as you know. And there in the genealogy of Christ in Luke chapter 3, verses 23 through 38, where Jesus is traced back not just to David and to Abraham, but all the way back to Adam, that concludes Adam, the son of God. In that genealogy of Christ, we find that it consists of 77 members, 77 units in that genealogy. Instead of 14 plus 14 plus 14, we now have 7 in a different form, 77. And this, it has been suggested, fits into a scheme among the Jews, an apocalyptic type of scheme where they divided the things into 12 weeks, the 12-week apocalypse. And Jesus, according to that scheme, as utilized by Luke, he stands at the end of the 11th week. 11 times the 7 week equals 77. Jesus stands at the end of the 11th week, and he introduces now the final week of the 12-week apocalypse. So it looks, again, in Luke's genealogy, as in Matthew's, that there is incompleteness, and that the incompleteness is signalized by the use of a conventional, significant numerical total of this kind. So now then the question will be, do we find any evidence of an interest in such conventional numbers in Genesis 5 and 11? Just before looking at that, however, let's note some other genealogies in the Bible which also are informed by these conventional numbers. Let's look at Genesis 10. Just before Genesis 11, as we said, we have in the 4th section of Genesis, the table of nations, Genesis 10, which gives us the descendants of the 3 sons of Noah. And as we analyze those, we note the following. As it deals with Japheth, we find that he has 7, we'll call them sons in quotation marks here. There's 7 to the first step removed from 7 grandsons, 7 names at a second step of removal from him. So 7 sons and 7 grandsons for Japheth. In the case of Shem, there are 5 sons and 5 grandsons. Structure of the book of Genesis, 5 pre-Abrahamic sections, 5 Abrahamic sections, but there's the balancing between the two. And then when you get the total of all of the descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, there are 70. 10 times 7, 70 descendants listed. And clearly these are incomplete. There are many other names that could have been added to that table of nations. But informing the whole process of selection was an interest in achieving these particular totals. Again, I mentioned Genesis 46, which is a list of the individuals who went down into Egypt with Jacob, and we spoke about the language of a woman bore someone who was actually not her immediate child. In that case, the total number of individuals who went down into Egypt is said to have been 70 souls. Now, again, that involves manipulating, dropping out names that could have been in there and so on, and if you included all the servants and everything, it'd be hundreds of people and so on. But clearly, the 70 is this literary feature that's the number to arrive at. Beyond the biblical evidence, there could be similar evidence in other ancient documents. We have material in Babylonian literature, for example, that is comparable to what the Bible is doing in tracing the history of these pre-Diluvian and post-Diluvian history of the various kings and so on. And there are the Babylonian king lists and the Sumerian king lists. And what has been found is that there is a tendency in listing these names. The 10 is the optimal number that you like to achieve. And so very often these lists will be shaped in terms of lists of 10. So what's going on in the Bible is part of a broader Near Eastern literary type of convention. All right. So given then that the appearance of such numbers would constitute a literary signal that the genealogy in question is not necessarily complete, what you find in Genesis 5, in Genesis 11 is the following. Each list has 10 names. Each list has 10 names, and the 10th one in each case has 3 sons. And so Noah has his 3 sons, and Terah has his 3 sons. But here's the nice same literary mentality. The same author is at work, and he is structuring the small pieces of his work in the same way that he has structured the larger one. So here's the balance between the two. Here's the first triad, here with the second. And the sections we're dealing with occupy the same position in the 2 triads. They're like here's this second one in each case. So their literary positions balance each other. Their numbers balance each other, 10 and 3 and so on. And I think that's a very clear signal to us then that we're on the wrong track if we are insisting that these genealogies must be complete. Here's a clear indication that something else is going on, and that the looser usage is not only warranted, but is indeed preferable here. Now, just before going on and mentioning weaknesses in the first view that I think then lead us to say beyond that our view is a probable one, that it's demanded, just one other little bit of information. We have a couple of places, one in Genesis 5:32 and another in Genesis 11:26, for the idiom of someone being X numbers of years old and then begetting someone that wasn't begotten that particular year. If that bothers you, the text now in our view would be saying that A is X numbers of years old and he begets someone whom he didn't beget in that particular year. And so beyond the language of begetting and so on, please note this, that in both of the verses I've just mentioned, in Genesis 5:32, for example, it says Noah was 500 years old and he begat, all right, X years old, and he begat. And who did he beget when he was 500 years old? Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the text says. They were not triplets. One of them then was born that year, the other 2 weren't. So here's a passage then that says that in a certain year, Noah begat someone whom he did not beget in that year, but sometime later on. So just for what it's worth, there's another example of that. And the same thing in Genesis 11:26. Here it's talking about Terah, T-E-R-A-H, Terah. He said he lived 70 years, and he begat Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Again, these boys were not triplets. One of them was born that year, the others weren't. So it's just a little bit more of the biblical evidence that you want to be aware of, lest you be insisting improperly on literalism, okay? So this selective view is warranted, and it is preferable in terms of the literary signals, and finally it is demanded when one begins to consider the problems you face on a literal view. Some inner biblical problems and some extra biblical problems with the complete view. On the complete view, on the first view, you would face the fact that in Abraham's day, possibly all the individuals mentioned in the Genesis 11 genealogy leading up to Abraham, including even Noah, but perhaps not Noah, but certainly from Shem on, all the individuals named there in Genesis 11 would still be alive in Genesis 11, in Genesis 12 when you come to Abraham. Now, when you read through that list of names after the flood in Genesis 11, and then you come up to Abraham at the end of Genesis 11 in chapter 12, is it your impression that all of those guys are still living? And as a matter of fact, not only would they all be living, but some of them actually would outlive Abraham himself on a literal computation of the list. For example, Shem, Salah, and Eber would be three who actually outlived Abraham. Now that simply is not the impression that you get from that data, and it might even raise some questions as to why all of these great heroes of the faith were bypassed, and other than when God was making his covenant to make the covenant with Abraham. There might be some reason for that, but that'd be something you'd have to think about. And also just note how long they would all be contemporaries of Abraham. And Abraham's as good as dead for the purposes of bearing children when he's 100, and he lived to 175, and that's fabulous, but these other guys are living hundreds of years longer, contemporaries with him, and so how is it so miraculous and wonderful or strange that Abraham should have children when he was 100 or more, when the same sort of thing was happening all over the place with these contemporaries of his. The picture seems to be that he belongs to another and later period when whatever is the cause of this decrease in the lifespan of individuals and the decrease in the period of time in which they were still able to bear children, whatever accounts for that, it seems that has happened and it belongs to the past by the time we do come to Abraham's period. You know, on the literal complete view, you have only 300 years from Noah to Abraham, and when you study the lifespans of these individuals, the lifespan of, let's say, an unusually long-lived person, but nevertheless possible lifespan, decrease from something on the order of 60. You would just read how long these people were living, 600 years and more. And so, and then by Abraham's day, you know, just even to round it out and be generous, 200 years would be a very long lifespan. So the lifespans, you might put it this way, have reduced these 400 years within 300 years under the same physical conditions, but a lot of things going on there that are very difficult to account for, just in terms of the inner biblical evidence. Now it's about time to leave, but just let me tick off then some other thoughts, and we'll have to repeat it as we move on with this general discussion next time. But when you look at the history of the Near Eastern world, you can see that the flood certainly had to be something that was farther back than about 2300 BC. Now, just as a general round number for Abraham, we can settle on about 2000 as a round number. Actually, it's probably something more like 2100 and so on. But you have only 300 years then from Abraham back to the flood, and therefore the flood, let's say 2400 BC on the complete view. And you look at all the developments ethnically, politically, linguistically that are even just described in Genesis 10 that are supposed to have taken place in that 10. In that 300 years, there's no way this could possibly take place. And there's all kinds of evidence clearly before where the flood comes, who knows, but there's no evidence of a flood on the scale of the biblical flood, even if not global. There's no evidence of a flood on the scale of the biblical flood this side of 2400 BC, or for that matter of 10,000 BC. So the flood is way back there, and the evidence is for all kinds of cultures and civilization which followed the flood, preceding the date of 2400 BC that you led to on the complete view. Gilgamesh, we talked about Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh, he's treated in the epic text with a lot of freedom and so on, but he was a real king, and he reigned about 2600 BC. So about 300 years before where the flood would come on the complete view is this figure of Gilgamesh. Now, the story in Gilgamesh, you remember, is that Gilgamesh, at the end of the thing, makes his way to the land of the immortals, in order to find the secret of immortality, and the immortal is Noah in the Babylonian text. Nehushtan is his name. And so the point is that Gilgamesh, who lived before the time of the flood, as far as the complete view would be concerned, Gilgamesh, for him, the flood was a matter of hoary antiquity. The flood here was a matter of the distant past, or from the way back beyond that. Just one other thing, from the area of Ebla and the texts that have been found there up in Syria, which come from where the complete view was with the flood, around 2400 BC. That means that there were already flood texts, texts incorporating the tradition of an ancient flood, long before that time. So there's just, you look in the Nile Valley, you look at the Mesopotamian Valley, and there are cultures and states and so on, far antedating anything that would be allowable within the 300-year period prior to Abraham. So the evidence is just overwhelming archaeologically and so on. You have sites of continuous occupation, Jericho, continuous occupation of cities, walled cities going back to about 7,000 BC without any indication of a disruption comparable to the biblical flood. There is no way in which you can handle all of this kind of stuff, altogether apart from the business of fossil remains, putting us back before 4000 BC for Adam and so on. All kinds of such extra biblical evidence, as well as the inner biblical problems that make the complete view utterly impossible, and therefore which shows that our selective view is demanded, and the rejection of it should not be regarded as an indication that one has lost his orthodoxy. Okay. Hope to then pick up on this next time, brought into the historicity, and then get into the even more difficult question of the days of Genesis. All right.